My son and his wife lived rent-free on my 96-acre apple farm. At dinner, her father raised a glass to our new $8.6 million resort, and my son slid a ceremonial paper toward me. They thought I was about to sign until I asked every investor to turn to page 14. I planted my first row of trees on this land the summer I turned 26, 3 years before I met Caroline, 4 before we married under the same oak that still stands at the top of the north field. 96 acres, most of it orchard, the rest split between a cider house Caroline built out of an old dairy barn and a farmhouse that's had 3 roofs and 1 kitchen since 1974. Caroline used to say a farm this size either runs you or you run it, and there's no version of owning it where you get to stand still in the middle and just watch. We raised Danny here. He learned to ride a bike on the gravel drive, broke his wrist falling out of the same tree twice in one summer, brought Renee here for the first time on a Sunday afternoon 8 years ago, and stood in the kitchen introducing her like she was already part of the deal. Caroline passed 4 years back. Ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end of it. I won't pretend the farm's been the same since. She was the one who kept the books, ran the roadside stand, remembered which of the part-time pickers needed extra hours before their kids' school started. I kept the trees alive. She kept everything else alive. After she was gone, the farm got quieter than I knew what to do with. Danny and Renee moved in a little under 3 years ago. Danny had lost his job at a logistics company during a round of layoffs, and Renee was between contracts doing marketing work for small businesses. I told them to stay as long as they needed. That's what the guest wing off the kitchen is for. Caroline's mother lived in it the last 2 years of her life, and it had been empty since. I never brought up rent. Never occurred to me to. This is still a working farm. There's plenty of work for 2 more sets of hands, and Danny pitched in some, driving the truck during harvest, helping Rosa, my orchard manager since Caroline's health started failing, with equipment repairs. Renee mostly kept to herself, working on her laptop at the kitchen table, taking calls out on the porch. I noticed things changing about a year in. Small things at first. Renee started asking questions about the property. How many acres exactly? Whether the cider house was insured separately? What the land had last been appraised at? I chalked it up to curiosity. Maybe some idea about expanding the cider business, which wouldn't have been a bad thing. Danny started spending more time with Renee's father, Walt, a man I'd met maybe 6 times in 8 years, mostly at holidays, always in a way that felt like he was sizing up the room rather than being in it. Walt had made money in commercial real estate, mostly strip malls and self-storage facilities outside the city, the kind of development that doesn't leave much of an impression beyond a parking lot. He talked about value-add opportunities the way other people talk about weather. I never disliked him exactly. I just never trusted the way he looked at things, like everything had a number attached that only he could see. About 8 months ago, Rosa mentioned that a survey crew had come through the East Orchard while I was in town for a doctor's appointment, said they'd told her they were doing routine soil work for a county assessment. I didn't think much of it. County does soil surveys every few years, nothing unusual. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. Then about 5 months ago, a package arrived addressed to the cider house. Linen napkins, a full case of them, embroidered with a gold apple tree and the words Founder's Table stitched beneath it. No note, no invoice inside, just a packing slip from a company called Cedar Run Retreats. I asked Danny about it. He said it was probably a marketing sample Renee had ordered for some client work. Nothing to worry about. I let it go. I had no reason then to think it was anything else. I think back on that now and wonder how many other small, strange things I let go over those months. A folder Renee left open on the kitchen table that I didn't look at closely enough. A phone call I overheard the tail end of, Danny's voice low, saying something like, he doesn't need to know yet, not until it's further along. A visit from a man in a suit who Rosa said introduced himself as a surveyor, but never once looked at soil. By the time the dinner invitation came, Renee mentioning almost offhand that her parents wanted to come up for a family dinner, nothing formal, I had no idea what was actually being built around me. I thought it was going to be an ordinary evening, pot roast maybe, Caroline's china if Renee felt like setting a nice table. I had absolutely no idea that a folder already existed with my name and my land inside it, priced, packaged, and ready to be signed away before I'd ever been told what it was. Walt and his wife, Judith, arrived first, a little before 6, towing a small trailer I assumed had wine in it. It had wine in it, but it also had a stack of navy blue folders, 40-some of them, each one embossed with the same gold apple tree from the napkins. I noticed that before anything else. The sheer number of them. More folders than there were people at the table. Big evening, Walt said, clapping me on the shoulder in a way that felt more like staff being greeted than family. He was wearing a blazer, which struck me as strange for a Tuesday dinner at a farmhouse, the kind of thing you wear when you want a room to take you seriously before you've said a word. Renee had set the table with Caroline's china, the good stuff, out of its cabinet for the first time since the funeral reception. I noticed that too. Small detail. The kind of thing that means something different depending on which way you're looking at it. At the time, I took it as a gesture. In hindsight, I think it was staging. Danny came down a little after everyone else, laptop bag over his shoulder even though we were sitting down to eat. He set it by his chair instead of leaving it in his room, which he'd never done before in 3 years of living here. He kept glancing at his phone through the whole first course, distracted in a way that didn't look like a man enjoying his family's company. We made it through most of dinner on ordinary conversation. Judith asked about the harvest, whether the late frost in April had done any real damage to the blossoms. It hadn't, not this year, though I remembered telling her the same thing the year before when it very much had. Walt asked, not for the first time, whether I'd ever considered unlocking some of the land's value, a phrase he used the way other men might use getting some fresh air, like it was just a healthy, obvious thing a person ought to do periodically. I gave him the same answer I always gave him. The land does what it's supposed to do. It grows apples. That's the value I'm interested in. He pressed a little further than usual that night, which I noticed even before I understood why. He mentioned a colleague of his who'd converted a family dairy farm into what he called agritourism, cottages and a tasting room, tripled the annual revenue inside 3 years. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed saying, watching my face for the specific reaction he was hoping to draw out of me. I told him I wasn't in this business for revenue multiples. I was in it because it was the last place on earth that still smelled like Caroline in October, and no cottage or tasting room was going to improve on that particular arithmetic. He laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't. It was over coffee that Walt stood, tapped his glass with a spoon, and said he wanted to say a few words. I assumed it was going to be some toast about family, the kind of thing people say at dinners that don't need saying but get said anyway. To our new $8.6 million resort, he said, raising his glass. I remember the room going very still, though maybe that's just how I remember it now, knowing what came after. Renee was smiling in a way that looked rehearsed. Judith was watching me carefully, like she was checking my face for a reaction before deciding how to feel about her own. Danny reached into his bag and pulled out one of the navy folders, sliding it across the table toward me the way you'd slide a check towards someone you were hoping wouldn't look too closely at the total. Dad, we wanted to show you something, he said. We've been working on it for a while. It's a real opportunity for the family. I opened the folder because I didn't yet have a reason not to. Inside were architectural renderings, the kind with soft lighting and small illustrated people strolling between buildings that didn't exist. 32 guest cottages laid out where my orchard rows currently stand, a spa building sitting roughly where the equipment shed is now, a glass-walled pavilion positioned, as best I could tell from the rendering, almost exactly on top of Caroline's rose garden. Cedar Run Retreats, the cover page read, a legacy reimagined. We wanted to do this properly, Walt said, still standing, still holding his glass like the toast wasn't finished. $8.6 million in projected value on the land alone. And it starts with you, Frank. This is your legacy, done right. I looked up at Danny. You've been working on this for a while, I said. How long is a while? He didn't quite meet my eyes. A few months. We wanted to have something real to show you, not just an idea. We knew you'd want to see it finished, Renee said, jumping in quickly, the way she did when she wanted to close a gap before I could ask what was inside it. Dad's already lined up 41 investors, most of them family, people who believe in this. 41 names. I hadn't heard a single one of them before that folder hit the table. Just look at page 14, Danny said. That's really all we're asking tonight. I flipped through the folder slowly, the way I read anything I don't yet trust. Contracts, seed catalogs, anything somebody's trying to sell me. The paper was heavy stock, the binding professional, the kind of packet built by people who understand that good production values make an idea feel more inevitable than it actually is. I noticed my name printed under a line reading land contributor, present tense, like I'd already agreed to something I'd never once been told about until an hour ago. I got to page 14. My signature sat at the bottom of page 14, clean and confident, dated 3 weeks back. I remember looking at it for a second too long, the way you look at a photograph of yourself you don't remember being taken. Because 3 weeks back, I hadn't been anywhere near a desk with a pen. I'd been 2 states over at my sister's place outside Roanoke, flat on my back after a hernia repair. My sister driving me home from the surgical center with a bag of prescriptions on my lap, and a strict instruction not to lift anything heavier than a coffee mug for 10 days. I remembered the date specifically because I'd missed calling Danny on his birthday that week and felt bad about it for days afterward. Kept meaning to apologize and kept forgetting to. This isn't my signature, I said. The table went quiet in a way that felt different from the earlier quiet, sharper somehow. Walt's smile held a beat too long, the kind of smile a man wears when he's already decided the conversation isn't going to go where you think it's going. Frank, it's right there, he said. We watched the notary process it. Watched what exactly? I wasn't in the state that week. Danny's face changed first, some flicker crossing it, the look of a man deciding in real time whether to keep going with a lie or start climbing out of one. Dad, can we not do this in front of everyone? Do what? I said. Ask why my name is on a document I never signed? I pulled out my phone. There was a number listed at the bottom of the packet for an escrow institution, the kind of detail you'd only notice if you were actually reading the document rather than being talked through it. I called it and put it on speaker right there at the table, 40-some Navy folders sitting around us like place settings nobody had asked for. A woman answered. Audrey, she said her name was, from the escrow department. She asked, in the careful tone of someone reading from a verification script, whether she was speaking with the land contributor listed on the Cedar Run hospitality file. I've never contributed land to anything, I said. Sir, we have a signed option agreement on file dated the 14th, she said, notarized by a Teresa Combs. I was under anesthesia on the 14th, I said. I have hospital discharge paperwork with a time timestamp that proves it. There was a pause on the line I didn't like the sound of. Walt's blazer suddenly looked a size too small on him, the way a costume looks wrong once you've seen behind it. Renee had gone very still, her fork resting halfway to her plate, not moving toward her mouth or back down to the table, just suspended there like she'd forgotten it existed. I set the phone down and asked the table one question, the only one that mattered right then. How many of you spoke to me directly before wiring your money into this? Nobody answered. I'd learn later from the actual investor list that it was 31 people, 31 signatures on 31 wire transfers, and not one of them had ever picked up a phone and called me. Then I asked my son to explain something specific. The scanner mark sitting just above the signature line on page 14, a faint gray smudge in the top right corner, right where the tail of the F in my name curls under. I'd seen that exact mark before. I pulled up a photo on my own phone, one I'd taken almost 2 years back of a tractor lease I'd signed at the dealership downtown, mostly because the dealer had made a joke about how ancient his scanner was, and I'd found it funny enough to photograph the receipt. Same smudge, same exact position, same defect from the same machine. That's not a coincidence, I said. That's my signature lifted directly off a lease and pasted onto a document I've never laid eyes on in my life. Danny didn't say anything. He just stared at the folder in front of him like it might, if he looked at it long enough, rearrange itself into something less damning. Tell me who scanned that lease, I said, quiet, the same tone I used to use on him when he was 8 years old, and I already knew the answer before I asked the question. He closed his laptop. I noticed his hands were shaking. I did, he said. I needed something clean. I thought if the resort actually got built, eventually you'd see that it worked, and none of this would matter anymore. Walt stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. This is a family conversation. We don't need to— Sit down, Walt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You built a company on a forged signature and used it to raise money from your own relatives. Sit down. He sat. Judith had both hands pressed flat against the table like she was bracing for something to shift under her. I looked at my son, 34 years old, my only child, sitting there with his laptop closed and an entire fabricated company sitting in a folder between us, and I felt something crack open that had nothing to do with the money at all. I'm calling my attorney in the morning, I said, not to bury you, Danny. To stop this before somebody's grandmother wires her retirement into a resort that was never going to get built on my land in the first place. Nobody touched their food after that. Walt left without his blazer, forgot it draped over the back of his chair in whatever hurry got him out the door. Judith left with him, quiet, glancing back at me once from the doorway with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not anger exactly. Something closer to the look of a woman doing arithmetic she didn't want to be doing. Renee stayed a moment longer, standing near the folder like she was deciding whether picking it up would help or hurt her case. This is fixable, she said, mostly to Danny, though I think some part of it was meant for me too. We can restructure the timeline. Nobody has to know exactly how far along things got before tonight. I didn't answer her. There wasn't anything in that sentence that needed a response from me. It was a plan being spoken aloud, not a question. Danny left last, standing by the door for a long moment, the way a person stands somewhere when they're not sure if leaving will make things better or simply end the conversation before it's finished. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask what happened next. He just said quietly that he hadn't expected me to figure it out that fast, which struck me, even in the moment, as an odd thing to be surprised by, as though the plan had always accounted for me eventually finding out, just not so soon. I sat at the table a long while after everyone had scattered, looking at that folder, at the rendering of a spa sitting on top of my wife's rose garden, thinking I finally understood what all those small, strange things over the past several months had actually been building toward. The survey crew Rosa had mentioned, the linen napkins with no invoice, the phone call I'd only caught the tail end of. Individually, none of them had seemed like much. Laid end to end, they'd been a company being built in the empty spaces of my own farm, quietly, for months, while I asked no real questions and assumed, because it was easier to assume, that my son wasn't capable of something like this. I thought that was the worst of it. I want to be honest and say that clearly, because I was wrong, and it took me another 2 weeks to find out exactly how wrong. Margaret Shaw has been my attorney for going on 20 years, since she helped Caroline and me set up the farm's succession structure back when Danny was still in middle school. She came out to the house the next morning, coffee in hand, and read through the folder twice before she said anything at all. This isn't a gray area, she said finally. This is forgery, and depending on how the money moved, likely securities fraud on top of it. I need you to understand the difference between a family disagreement and a crime before we decide what to do next, because those two things require very different responses. I told her I understood. I'm not sure at the time that I fully did. She called the escrow bank formally that afternoon, identifying herself as counsel and requesting a full accounting. It took 2 days to get anything back, and when it came, it was worse than the version Audrey had read off a script the night of the dinner. An account had been opened 4 months earlier under the name Cedar Run Hospitality LLC. Members listed Daniel Whitfield, my son, as managing member, Renee Porter Whitfield, chief development officer, Walter Porter, chairman of the founding investors group. The land option, the one built on my forged signature, priced the farm at $8.6 million with an option fee of $10. $10. My son had put a $10 price tag on land that took his mother and me 40 years to build and listed his own name where mine should have been. Investor units had been sold sold at $25,000 apiece, 31 of them confirmed so far, all on the promise that Cedar Run controlled land it had never once had legal claim to. $800 and change thousand sitting in the escrow account. Another figure, Margaret wouldn't confirm the number until the bank gave her something firmer, that appeared to have moved somewhere the account statements didn't fully explain. I want you to sit with something before we go further, Margaret told me, in the careful voice she uses when she's about to make a day worse. Almost every name on that investor list is related to Renee. Aunts, cousins, a family friend from her father's business. 41 names. And by my count, 39 of them are people who trusted Walt's word that this land belonged to Cedar Run. And all 41 are coming to my table for Thanksgiving, I said. Renee had mentioned it in passing weeks earlier. A big family gathering, 40-some people, nothing formal. At the time, I'd assumed it was simply a large family enjoying a large table. I understood now it had been something closer to a groundbreaking ceremony dressed up as a holiday. Margaret's advice was to cancel the dinner outright. I understood the logic. It would have been the clean thing to do, the thing that protected me most directly. But I kept thinking about those 39 relatives who had no idea what they'd actually put their money into, who would simply be told, if I canceled, that a confused old man had gotten cold feet about his own son's business. A forged signature would quietly become a family disagreement about succession, the kind people whisper about at gatherings for years without ever getting the facts straight. So I chose the harder path. I told Margaret I wanted to host the dinner, not to sign anything, not to make peace, but to let the evidence walk itself into my own dining room in front of everyone it concerned. If we do this, Margaret said, we do it exactly right. You sign nothing. You threaten no one. You make no promises to any investor, verbal or otherwise. I'll notify the bank formally, file an affidavit disputing the option, and request an emergency order freezing any transfer of the land. And Frank, I need you to let me and the accountant do the digging, not Danny, not Rosa, not out loud around the farm, quietly. I agreed to all of it. Rosa, when I told her what I could, didn't ask many questions. She simply started securing the deed files in the fireproof cabinet in the cider house office and took a quiet inventory of the farm equipment, the kind of practical caution that comes from 30 years of watching things go wrong on a farm and knowing which problems get worse if you wait. Neil, who's handled the farm's books since before Caroline passed, began preserving every email tied to the farm's shared drive, the ones Danny still had access to as a listed manager on some of our old cider house paperwork. It didn't take him long to find the first thing that made my stomach turn in a new direction entirely. Drone photography of the orchard, high resolution, clearly professional, dated back nearly 5 months, well before any conversation about a resort had reached me. Marketing materials built around it, a full investor prospectus with the Cedar Run branding, my orchard rendered as a backdrop for cottages that didn't exist yet, sent out to prospective investors as though the deal were already finalized, an invoice for $22,000 from a design firm, coded in the company's own books as though it were for cider bottle labels. Buried in the same batch of records, a referral fee, $8,000, paid out to Renee personally from that same invoice. And then, the detail that told me more than anything else had, someone using Danny's login credentials had downloaded over a 2-week period 4 months earlier, my driver's license, 3 years of my tax returns, and Caroline's death certificate. I sat with that piece for a long time before I said anything to Margaret about what I thought it meant. Not proof of anything criminal on its own, maybe, but it told me they'd been building more than an investor packet. They'd been building a closing file, the kind of documentation you assemble when you need to make an ownership chain look complete, airtight, uncontested. The kind of file you build when you're preparing for the possibility that the actual owner won't be around or won't be believed by the time anyone comes looking closely. The notary's name was Teresa Combs, according to the seal on page 14. It took Margaret 2 phone calls to reach her, and when she did, the conversation lasted 11 minutes and ended with Teresa crying on the other end of the line. She hadn't witnessed me sign anything. She told Margaret that plainly without much prompting. Renee, who it turned out was a distant cousin of hers, close enough to have grown up attending the same holidays, had approached her 9 days after my actual surgery date and told her I'd already signed the document at home, that dragging an elderly man back out for a formality so soon after a procedure would be needlessly cruel, and that all Teresa needed to do was notarize what was already on the page and backdate the seal to match the file. In exchange, Teresa and her husband had been given a $5,000 credit toward a founder investment unit in Cedar Run, on top of which they'd put in $20,000 of their own money, trusting the whole arrangement because it had come from family. She said it felt wrong, Margaret told me afterward. She told me that plainly too, but she also said Renee made it sound like the alternative was putting a man barely out of surgery through an unnecessary ordeal, and she didn't want to be the reason for that. I sat with that a long while. It was, in its own way, worse than the forged signature itself. Danny had lifted a mark off a lease. That was theft of a kind, but it was theft of an image, a shape on a page. What Renee had done was different. She'd taken something true, that I had in fact just had surgery, that I was in fact recovering, and used the true part of it as a lever to manufacture the false part. She hadn't just forged a document, she'd forged a kindness, and used it as the delivery mechanism for a fraud. Margaret's forensic accountant, a quiet, thorough woman named Priya, spent the better part part of 10 days going through every account tied to Cedar Run Hospitality, every wire transfer, every invoice. What she found, piece by piece, redrew the shape of the whole thing. The $800,000 plus sitting in escrow wasn't the full picture. $98,000 had already been released from that account, approved using my forged signature on a disbursement authorization to an outfit called VPM Hospitality Strategies. It took Priya less than a day to trace the ownership. VPM, Vanessa Porter Mercer. Renee's maiden name, technically, folded into an LLC she'd registered herself 11 months earlier, well before Cedar Run had a name at all. Her own company, paid from money that investors believed was being held for land she had never owned a single square foot of. There was more. A $380,000 gap between what investors had wired in total and what the escrow account actually reflected, money that appeared to have moved through two intermediate accounts before landing somewhere Priya's access didn't yet reach. She flagged it for the bank's fraud division, and for Margaret both, the kind of number that turns a civil dispute into something with federal attention attached to it. I didn't tell Danny or Renee any of what we'd found. Margaret was firm about that, and I understood why. If they knew the extent of what had surfaced, they'd have time to build a defense around it before Thanksgiving, time to rehearse an explanation, time to decide which parts of the truth they were willing to hand over and which parts they'd keep burying. I wanted them walking into that dinner the same way I had 2 weeks earlier, sure of themselves, confident the story still held. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I called an emergency meeting of the farm's small board. Myself, Margaret as counsel, Neil, and Rosa, the four of us who'd actually run this place for the better part of a decade. Danny still held a technical management title on some of the cider house paperwork from years back, a formality neither of us had bothered updating. I laid the forged option agreement on the table in front of him, beside the tractor lease with its matching scanner mark. He wouldn't touch either page. Who authorized this? I asked him. It's a concept, he said. A diversification plan. It was never meant to actually close without your sign-off, Dad. It was momentum. Something to show investors were serious before we brought you the finished version. Who authorized raising money from your wife's family using land that isn't yours to offer? They're sophisticated investors, he said. They understood the risk. Where did the missing $380,000 go, Danny? He didn't have an answer for that one. He said the bank had the records, which wasn't a denial so much as a way of not saying the words himself. I placed the 2022 tractor lease beside page 14, side by side, the two smudges lined up almost perfectly. You copied it, I said. I didn't prepare the file myself, he said, which was, I noticed, not actually a denial either. The board voted to suspend him. Access to every farm system, any authority to represent Whitfield Orchards in any capacity, revoked 4 votes to 1, his own vote the only one against it. He left that meeting and, according to what Rosa told me afterward, went straight to Renee and told her I was staging an ambush, that I'd turned the entire family board against him before he'd even had a chance to explain. I told Rosa to lock the chemical shed, secure the farm vehicles, and post one of the harvest crew supervisors near the cider house through the holiday. Quietly, nothing dramatic, just enough presence that nothing walked off the property in the chaos of 40 people arriving for a dinner that was going to look very different from what any of them were expecting. Then I went home to get ready to receive them. They started arriving a little after 9, minivans and rented SUVs filling the gravel drive faster than I'd seen it fill in years, one motorhome parking itself, without asking anyone, directly on top of what used to be Caroline's rose garden before I'd had it cut back for winter. 41 people by the final count, plus a handful of children too young to understand what any of the adults were doing there. Walt arrived with Judith and a second trailer, this one carrying nothing but more of the Navy folders and 2 cases of wine with Cedar Run's gold apple tree stamped onto custom labels. 46 folders this time. He'd printed enough for children who couldn't yet read. The architectural renderings went up on an easel in my own library before I'd even had my coffee, positioned so that anyone walking from the kitchen to the dining room would pass directly beneath an aerial view of 32 guest cottages laid out across my orchard, a glass pavilion floating serenely above what used to be Caroline's roses. Renee found me in the kitchen around 11, already dressed for the day, already moving through the house with the particular energy of someone hosting an event they believe is going exactly according to plan. She handed me a printed schedule, Founders Thanksgiving Service, the heading read, with my name listed beside 11 separate tasks, none of which I'd agreed to. I set it down without comment. She didn't seem to notice, or chose not to. At one point, passing through the library, I heard Danny's voice, low, through the crack of a mostly closed door. We just need him to say the paperwork's fine. That's it. Once he says it in front of everyone, this whole thing resolves itself and we move forward. I didn't go in. I'd heard enough of that particular argument already, delivered at increasing volume, the night he'd come to my locked bedroom door 11 days earlier and asked, quiet through the wood, how long I planned on holding on to everything at 72 years old. I'd told him then, and I meant it now, that I intended to hold on to the decision of what happened to what I'd built for exactly as long as I judged fit, and not one day less because he found the waiting inconvenient. By 2:30, 46 chairs had been arranged across my dining room and library both, more people than the house had held at one time since Caroline's funeral reception. A Navy folder sat at every place setting, mine Mine included. Mine positioned dead center at the head of the table, like a piece of the day's actual menu. Walt stood near the easel with a glass already in hand, waiting, I understood now, for exactly the moment he'd rehearsed. Renee moved between tables, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling. Danny sat near me, close enough that I could see his hand shaking slightly against his water glass, close enough that I don't think he yet understood how much further this day was going to travel from the version he'd planned. Margaret arrived at 2:40, parking her modest sedan discreetly at the edge of the gravel drive, well behind the motorhome, and walked in through the side kitchen door rather than the front. With her, a forensic accountant I hadn't met in person before that day. Priya, the woman whose 10 days of quiet work had redrawn the entire shape of what I now understood my son and his wife had built. And behind her, a process server, a young man in a plain gray jacket, who looked entirely unbothered by the number of Navy folders scattered across the house he was about to walk into. I nodded to Margaret through the kitchen doorway. She nodded back. It was time. I walked to the head of the table, where my own folder sat waiting, and I did not sit down. Before anyone drinks to ownership of anything, I said, I have a question for the room. Walt lowered his glass slightly, uncertain, the toast half formed on his face. How many of you invested because you were told Cedar Run Retreats already controlled this farm? 31 hands went up around that dining room, slow at first, then all at once, the way a held breath finally lets go. Keep them up, I said. If you spoke to me directly, even once, before wiring your money in. Every hand came down. I held up the tractor lease beside page 14, the way I had 2 weeks earlier, and asked the room to look closely at the small gray smudge above the F in my name, identical in both. Downloaded, Priya would confirm minutes later on the screen she and Margaret set up at the end of the table, from our farm's own shared drive in June, using Danny's login credentials, 4 months before anyone told me a resort existed at all. Renee called this a family conversation, I said. I'd like to know who else in this room heard me approve any of it. No one answered. 41 people, and the silence sat there long enough that a child near the back asked, in the clear, unbothered voice children use in rooms full of adult tension, why everyone had stopped talking. That's when the doorbell rang. Margaret walked in with Priya and the process server, and within a minute, Danny and Renee had both been formally served. A restraining order limiting their access to farm accounts and property, a preservation notice for all Cedar Run records, and a filed dispute of the land option itself. Copies handed to each of them in the middle of their own family's Thanksgiving table. The money never left escrow, Renee said quickly, to the room more than to me, the practiced brightness in her voice cracking slightly at the edges. Everyone's investment is completely safe. Danny closed his laptop, the same reflex I'd watched 2 weeks earlier, and then reopened his mouth to say something that landed worse than anything else he'd said that entire fall. Dad is 72, he told the table. He's still grieving Mom. He's not entirely reliable right now, and I think everyone deserves to understand this is a capacity question, not a fraud question. I understood in that moment that he'd rehearsed that particular sentence. It had the shape of something practiced in a mirror. Margaret answered before I had to. A cognitive evaluation this past September found no impairment whatsoever, she said, flat, unhurried. I have the report. And Teresa Combs' own signed statement confirms she never once witnessed Frank sign anything. Medical records place him under anesthesia at the exact hour she certified as the signing appointment. Teresa's mother, sitting 3 chairs down, asked quietly where her daughter was. At a motel with counsel, Margaret said, because Renee asked her this morning to backdate the record a second time to cover the gap in the file. Priya turned her laptop screen toward the table. The money trail filled it. $1.22 million raised in total, $742,000 of it now frozen by the bank's fraud division, $161,000 unaccounted for, $60,000 of that last figure traced directly to a deposit on a condominium in Richmond, titled in Renee's name alone. Danny turned to his wife in front of all 41 relatives and asked her, for what I understood was the first time out loud, where the money had actually gone. She turned right back on him. You're the one who built the file, she said. You're the one who put his signature on it. You told me it wouldn't matter once it worked, he said. Buried in the servers Neil had preserved, Priya had found one final piece, an email from Danny dated in June, 5 months before that first Thanksgiving folder had ever hit my table. She read it aloud to the room, plainly, without embellishment, because it didn't need any. This scan is clean enough. Use only the signature page. If Dad sees the full option before founder commitments are locked in, he'll stop it. There was no more room, after that sentence, for the story that he'd simply been swept along by people bigger and louder than himself. He'd known. He'd planned around the exact possibility that I might object, and built the file specifically so that objecting would come too late to matter. I stood at the head of my own table, 41 relatives and my own son and his wife, all watching to see what I'd do with a truth that size, and I found there wasn't much left to say that the evidence itself hadn't already said better than I could. The investigation ran the better part of a year. A court-appointed receiver took control of Cedar Run Hospitality's accounts within a week of that Thanksgiving, and by spring, investors had recovered 89 cents on every dollar they'd put in, not whole, but not nothing, which Priya told me was better than most cases like this ever managed. Walt sold a lake property to help cover part of the shortfall, and spent a long stretch of that winter quietly repaying relatives he'd personally promised, at some point or another, that their money was safe. Teresa surrendered her notary license and pleaded guilty to filing a false certificate. She testified, eventually, against the very family that had asked her to do it in the first place, and I've thought more than once about the particular unfairness of a woman losing her livelihood over a kindness someone else weaponized. Danny was formally terminated from any role with the company that spring for falsifying records and misusing farm-adjacent assets to raise investor money. He kept whatever ownership stake existed on paper, technically, though any future payout would first have to satisfy what a court determined he owed. He pleaded guilty that fall to conspiracy and forgery. Renee pleaded guilty separately to fraud and to running an unregistered securities offering, admitting on the record that she'd knowingly used a copied signature and had personally asked Teresa to backdate the notary seal. At Danny's sentencing, I was asked to speak, and I told the court the truest thing I had, that my son hadn't actually managed to take my land. The bank had stopped that before it ever closed. What he'd taken was trust from 31 people who believed his last name made his promises safe, and he'd used my age as a weapon in both directions at once, capable enough to forge a signature when it suited the plan, too old and too fragile to be believed when I tried to say it wasn't mine. When the judge asked if this had simply been a family misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand, I said no. Families misunderstand who was supposed to bring the folding chairs for Thanksgiving. A copied signature and a backdated notary stamp aren't a misunderstanding. They're a decision, made more than once by more than one person. Danny stood to speak near the end of it, and for the first time since that first dinner, he didn't reach for an explanation. He didn't blame Renee or Walt or the plan itself for having taken on a life of its own beyond what he'd intended. I chose it, he said, and his voice broke somewhere in the middle of those 3 words. Outside the courthouse afterward, he apologized, not in a way meant to change the sentence that had already been handed down by then, but because, in his own words, he'd made my death feel useful to him before I was anywhere close to it, and he understood now what that had actually cost, separate from whatever the court decided he owed. I told him I was still working toward not carrying hatred for what he'd done. It was the most honest thing I had to offer him that day, and it wasn't much, but it was true. And I found that true things, even small ones, tend to hold up better over time than the comfortable ones do. Then I hugged him anyway, out there on the courthouse steps, because some things stay true even after a courtroom has finished sorting through all the facts of a case, and because he is still, in every way that matters to me most, my son. The Thanksgiving after that one, 18 people came instead of 41. No Navy folders, no easel in the library. Judith came alone for dessert only, and didn't stay long. Walt didn't come at all. Not banned, exactly. Just not ready yet. And I understood that better than he probably assumed I did. Danny's daughter, Sophie, handed me a letter near the end of that dinner. One he'd written from the work release program where he was learning bookkeeping and paying down what the court had ordered, a little at a time. He wrote that the worst thing he'd learned about himself that year wasn't the fear of losing the farm, or even the fear of prison. It was realizing he'd made his own father disappear inside his own house, quietly, months before he ever put a single forged page down on that table, that the real theft had started long before the paperwork did, in all the small, ordinary conversations he'd simply stopped having with me, because it was easier to build a company in the silence than to sit across from me and ask for what he actually wanted. He asked for nothing in the letter. No forgiveness scheduled in advance, no place held open at some future table, just the truth, written plainly, more honestly than either of us had managed to say it out loud in longer than I wanted to admit. That night, after everyone had gone, I put his letter in the hall drawer, the one that's held small, useless things for 40 years, a child's mitten someone left behind one Christmas and never came back for, a few photographs Caroline never got around to framing. The drawer doesn't lock. It never has. Some things I've decided don't need to be locked to be protected. They just need finally to be true.